Western Civilization. How much do you know? My name is Russell Miles and this is the 34th episode of our Western Civilization series. In the last episode we covered the Battle of Britain and the struggle between the German and British air forces. The Luftwaffe deployed 3 Luftflotten, or air fleets, against Britain. Luftflotten 2 and 3 were arrayed along the French coastline, with Luftflotten 5 in Norway. Essentially a mix of fighters and bombers based in one area, focusing on targets within range. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff, German High Command, had directed increased pressure on Britain to force negotiations. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief, ordered the RAF to be destroyed. General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was in command of Luftwaffe 2 and General Field Marshal Hugo Spierl was in command of Luftwaffe 3. Spierl wanted to attack the RAF's bases and air defence infrastructure, whereas Kesselring favoured bombing London to pressure Britain into submission or to draw the RAF fighters into a decisive battle. They were to wax and wane between these objectives with no consistent focus. The Luftwaffe's tactics were to assign some fighters to sweep ahead of the bombers, ostensibly to clear enemy fighters, then with the remainder of the fighters to closely escort the bombers towards their target. This essentially saw the fighters bound to the speed of the bombers and the bombers limited to the range of the fighters, which often counted fuel reserves in battle within minutes. In contrast, the United States Army Air Force, as it was then known, refined its tactics so that bombers would fly the most circumspect route, forming up in large formations, avoiding heavily defended areas, and even facing towards one city then turning in another direction. The fighters would be divided into groups, which would rendezvous with the bombers having flown independently at the most fuel economical speed and height. They would then pursue any attacking fighters, with later groups of fighters meeting up and taking over, disrupting and destroying enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe continued to strive for air superiority. At various times their intelligence led them to believe that the RAF was exhausted, only for the British to continue to rise up each day for battle. The Germans' intelligence was limited, with agents on the ground being rounded up, reconnaissance aircraft intercepted, and signals traffic having them believe that the RAF's command and control systems were rigid and inflexible, whereas it was able to respond to the Germans' twists and turns in strategy. On 31st August, the Luftwaffe struck 6 airfields, including Biggin Hill, and put sector control out of commission. The RAF lost 37 fighters. This was the Germans' best day, but they also lost 33 aircraft. And sector control rooms were little more than a classroom with a large map and telephone connections. One backup control room was in a disused village butcher's shop. The Germans could control their rest and maintenance demands as they determined the pace of the battle, but they had a timeline too. Weather would soon make any invasion unfeasible. The losses for the RAF did have Hugh Downing consider withdrawing aircraft to the Midlands and out of German fighter range to preserve the force. This would have conceded air superiority over to South East England. However, it was the German aircraft that were disproportionately shot down, 41 on 7 September, 56 on 15 September and 57 on 29 September. Events were also taking their own turn. German bombers had inadvertently bombed London and the British had bombed Berlin in turn, neither causing any significant military damage, but Hitler wanted London to be attacked in revenge. German commanders also felt that an attack on London would force large numbers of British fighters into the air to be destroyed and worn down. On 14 September, due to the failure of the Luftwaffe to establish air supremacy, German High Command promised to review the situation, and then on 17 September Hitler postponed any invasion indefinitely. The RAF had commenced the battle with 1,100 fighter pilots and around 800 aircraft. The RAF was to lose 600 killed and maimed out of the 3,000 pilots that were eventually deployed, along with 1,100 fighters destroyed. They managed to sustain and increase their force over the battle. The Luftwaffe had 1,450 experienced fighter pilots with 1,200 fighter aircraft and a similar number of bombers. By October, the German losses were over 4,000 aircrew killed, maimed or captured, with 2,000 aircraft destroyed, and no longer able to maintain the number of sorties. The Luftwaffe was to continue night bombing. The Brits killed over 43,000 civilians over the next 12 months. Churchill was voted out of office, but not until the 6th of July 1945, 2 months after the war in Europe ended. A friend of my father was a navigator in the Royal Australian Air Force. In the 1960s, he had an exchange posting in the United Kingdom. Part of his training was to participate in a map exercise on air defence. As in the past, the bombers managed to get through despite their best efforts. After their futile efforts, their trainers pointed out the school solution. A little way off, over the North Sea, a British V-bomber, a jet-age ancestor of the Lancaster and their ilk, had been orbiting about, seemingly unconnected to the scrambling of interceptors. However, this V-bomber carried 8 hydrogen bombs and was tasked to attack the home country of any attacking bombers. Maybe the V-bomber would get shot down, maybe it wouldn't. Any enemy had to factor in the utter devastation by nuclear fire of their homeland if they dared attack Britain. Hence, the few modern jet fighters merely had to be assigned to protect the bombers' bases, not the entire country, as did Hugh Downing. The V-bombers were later replaced by rockets firing from submarines. The hideous science fiction fears from the 1920s had become a commonplace reality. Hugh Downing was pushed into retirement after the Battle of Britain. He was initially given a roving ambassadorial role to America to look at aircraft acquisition. He then returned after a few months, wrote an account of the battle. Churchill sought to intervene for him to have an appropriate role. Even the King queried why he was denied the traditional promotion upon retirement for victorious commanders. But by this stage he insisted on retirement. Maybe it was embarrassing for him to have sought an appropriate role, and the establishment would have no end of useless jobs which would have rubbed salt into the wound. He was made a baron in 1943. Aside from not being from the gentry, there were 2 other factors that may have influenced Sir Hugh Downing's treatment. Firstly, he'd long been interested in spiritualism. This was a fad around the early 19th century. Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the many famous adherents. If the carnage of the Great War that Sir Hugh Downing had experienced had not contributed to his obsession with the dead, it was probably the loss of his first wife after only 2 years. He later told fellow commanders that their dead comrades assured him they were happy. He was also a member of the Fairy Investigation Society and the Ghost Club. He later remarried Lady Muriel Downing. They were both vegetarians and passionate about anti-vivisection. Again, concern for animal welfare may not have been in accord with a gentry that enjoyed fox hunting. Sir Hugh Downing died on 15 February 1970, aged 87. Sir Keith Parkes was assigned a series of important wartime assignments, including the defence of Malta, which has the distinction of having been the most bombed place in human history, and then Allied Air Commander, Southeast Asia. He was also considered to be head of the Royal Australian Air Force, but seems to have been blackballed by General MacArthur. At war's end, he was advised there was no further military post available for him. This was unremarkable. Demobilisation meant millions of service personnel taking up civilian life. That the British could see no need to find a suitable public role for such an esteemed figure is disappointing enough, but he was one of New Zealand's most famous sons. Were they miffed that he had left the New Zealand Army for the British back in 1915? There is irony, as the largest contingent of colonial fighters in the Battle of Britain were Kiwi, 129. Before the war, the tiny New Zealand Air Force had a mere 20 pilots and not many more aircraft, so when a young man with ambitions to fly would make their way to the UK. A fitting honour might have been Governor-General. His reputation was as a fair and thoughtful commander who made regular contact with troops, which would seem to make him ideal for such a vice-regal role. But it was not until 1967 that a New Zealand-born Governor-General was to be appointed. Sir Keith Parkes lived in New Zealand until his death in 1975, aged 82 years. However, not only was no suitable role found for Sir Keith Parkes, but there was not even a statue erected to his memory. This in a country where you can find edifices to Freddie Mercury, Bill Shankly, Charlie Chaplin and Red Tree, 3 times Grand National winner. Only on 15 September 2010 was a statue finally erected in Waterloo Place, paid for by public subscription. Sir Keith Parkes did have a West County class steam locomotive named after him, but really. However, the Germans managed to bestow what may have been the best honorific of all. Luftwaffe intelligence personnel studied the personalities of enemy commanders so as to give some sense of likely action. Air Vice Marshal Lee Melroy, who commanded 12 Group, was referred to as the Flying Sergeant due to his petty ways, but Sir Keith Parkes was known as the Defender of London. What could be better? Why weren't Sir Hugh Downing and Sir Keith Parkes better rewarded? My humble guess is that they had been only too well aware of the high stakes with which they were playing, the very responsibilities for so many lives, with the prospect of gas attacks and biological warfare. The pressure must have had an effect. For airmen too long in war, and one is inevitably made mad. Perhaps there were 2 more casualties. Our next podcast will continue the theme of aerial warfare by looking at Canada's malicious Cold War strategy and the Western Nuclear Alliance. If you like this channel, please subscribe and tick like. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I can be contacted at email russmills@iprimus.com.au. Thanks for listening.